Welcome to Aviation News Talk. Coming up on today's program, we have a lot of general aviation news, including a Delta Airlines crew that aids in the rescue of a downed Cirrus SR22. Some Cessna 182 and Beech Bonanza owners are going to have to shell out big bucks in the next 100 hours because of a new engine service bulletin. Diamond introduces a new airplane at Friedrichshafen, Germany, and it's a beautiful one. And you may soon have a wireless hotspot for your GA aircraft. Plus, more general aviation stories and the reasons so many Cessna 182 pilots damaged the nose wheel during landing and techniques to avoid that happening. All this and more, and the news starts now. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Trescott, and if you enjoy the show, please tell your friends. From ABC News, 2 people on board a plane that crashed into the side of a mountain in the Olympic National Park in Washington state last week have survived after making a distress call that was picked up by a nearby Delta Airlines flight. Delta confirmed that their Flight 589 from Seattle to Shanghai heard the distress call on the emergency frequency and established communications with the 2 pilots on the ground. The pilots of Flight 589 contacted air traffic control, which led to the dispatch of a Navy search and rescue team. The Navy team rescued the instructor and student from an elevation of about 5,000 feet on Mount Jupiter at about 6 p.m. local time with an MH-60S helicopter. The nursing supervisor at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle says the pair are in serious condition but are improving in intensive care. The NTSB said that the student instructor in the Cirrus SR22 crashed about 3:48 p.m. local time after taking off from a nearby airport for a local flight. Now, the photos of this are really quite spectacular. You can see the aircraft partially buried into the snow, and the tail appears to be essentially broken off at the rear of the empennage. Now, interestingly, the parachute was not deployed during the crash. On the COPA forum, the Cirrus Owner Pilots Association, some people have speculated that this might have been an engine out and that they attempted to land at about 70 miles an hour on the side of the mountain. People really don't think that this was a controlled flight into terrain, as they expect that there would have been far more serious injuries to both pilots. But we won't know for some time. But in the meantime, if you are out flying around, remember the FAA now requires us to monitor 121.5 at all times. And because this Delta crew was doing that, they were able to pick up the call from these pilots after the crash. From Flying Magazine, a new service bulletin from Continental Motors is going to cost some Cessna 182 and Beech Bonanza owners big bucks in the next 100 hours because of a new engine service bulletin. Continental says they think that some aviation maintenance technicians missed the point of an earlier engine service bulletin, SB05-8A, which they first issued in 2005. That document announced a camshaft replacement that Continental said would improve the operation of several engines like the IO470 and the IO550, which are used in many aircraft, including 182s and Bonanzas. The replacement was designed to prevent a possible gear tooth fracture and a possible power failure that could follow. Now, last week on the Airplane Geeks podcast, which you can find at airplanegeeks.com, we interviewed Mike Bush, who was talking about that service bulletin and said that he thought it was going to become mandatory, which it has. From Red Bull, the Red Bull Air Race World Championship makes a return to San Diego this weekend, April 15th and 16th. Now, the race was last held there in 2009, proved to be popular with fans, according to Red Bull, who asked that it return. Well, it is here in 2017. Now, the course for that race is pretty spectacular. It's over the San Diego Bay, so spectators can watch it from the shore. Nicholas Ivanov won in the skies above the Pacific coast in 2009. He'll be back looking to do it again this weekend as the Red Bull Air Races return to San Diego. Turning now to international news, last week I discussed the Aero 2017 show in Friedrichshafen, Germany. More news coming out of that show. Diamond Aircraft has launched 3 new diesel-powered singles with 4 new engine combinations. This comes from avweb.com, and they say that Flight International reported that Diamond will produce the following 4-place aircraft, and this is a bit of a tongue twister, so stick with me. They're going to have the DA50-4, which is a 4-place aircraft, a 5-place DA50-5, and a 7-place DA50-7. and these aircraft will have respectively engines of 230 horsepower, 260, and 360 horsepower. These are Safran SMA diesel engines. The DA50-7 will also be available with a 375 horsepower Lycoming gas engine or a Ukrainian turboprop. The DA50-5 version flew in March, and it was on display at Aero 2017. Diamond owner Christian Dries told Flight International that the DA50-5 will be certified by 2018. Now, we had a listener, Ute Stumpf, who was visiting the show last week. She sent me a photograph of the DA50, and the colors were absolutely spectacular. Just an amazing gold surface that reflected just a wide collection of beautiful colors. I'll post that in the show notes so you can take a look at it. In other international news from Flyer magazine, which is from the UK, Airbus has abandoned its plan to produce the electric E-Fan two-seat as a ready-for-sale training aircraft. The French company says the pace of development in the electric aircraft field has moved its ambitions onward. We recognize that the progress is fast in electric and hybrid electric propulsion, said a spokesman. This plane has done its job. Today, a large part of the technologies developed for the E-Fan are being done in a new project. They went on to say that new project is going to be the E-Fan X, and that in the next 3 years, they felt that they will have a 2-megawatt motor, which is about a 10x increase. They said that for single-aisle aircraft, such as airliners with the hybrid electric propulsion, we're talking about 20 to 40 megawatt power. Whether this will take another 3 years to happen, we don't know for sure, but we need to build the 2-megawatt demonstrator and see how the technology pans out. Well, while this may be good for the development of future electric airliners, this is pretty disappointing news for folks like me involved in flight instruction. We continue to look for low-cost trainers that will lower the cost of flight instruction, and there have been a lot of predictions that some electric aircraft could reduce the cost down to the $15 an hour range to pay for the electricity to run one of these aircraft, and we certainly could use an airplane like the E-Fan, so it's too bad that they've decided to discontinue it. On the other hand, I think that Airbus probably correctly figured out that they can make a lot more money selling airliners than they can make selling two-place trainers. In other international news from AvWeb, electric-powered aircraft will gather for a fly-in at the Grenchen airport in Switzerland, September 9th through 10th, in the first event of its kind in Europe. The organizers of what they call the Smart Flyer Challenge say they expect a range of aircraft to attend, including the Hamilton Aero Twister single-seat aerobatic composite aircraft, an Antares electric self-launching glider, the Siemens eFusion two-seater, and a Pipistrel Alpha Electro. Even more aircraft are expected to join the lineup by September. So this is good news. A lot of people working to advance the development of electric aircraft. Speaking of electrics, from AOPA, Walter Extra has further cemented his status as a legendary figure in aviation, setting a new world electric airplane speed record in March to go with the electric time to climb mark that he set in November. His Extra 330 LE is powered by a nearly silent 110-pound electric motor that Siemens produces. It puts out 260 kilowatts, equivalent to about 348 horsepower. It first flew in July of 2016 and began breaking records this past November. At that time, Walter Extra flew it to a new time to climb record reaching 3,000 meters, which is 9,842 feet, in 4 minutes and 22 seconds. And on April 4th, it was announced that the Extra also set the first 182-knot record over a 3-kilometer course, which is about 209 miles an hour, with a takeoff weight below 1,000 kilograms. Frank Anton, head of E-Aircraft at Siemens, said that the 330 LE with the Siemens motor is both demonstrating the potential of electric power in aviation and serving as a testbed for a motor for a future on much larger aircraft. He said, quote, just 6 such propulsion units would be sufficient to power a typical 19-seat hybrid electric aircraft. Anton said that Siemens and Airbus are working together to scale up a hybrid electric propulsion to regional airliner size. By 2030, they expect to see the first airplanes carrying up to 100 passengers and having a range of about 100 kilometers, which would be, around 600 miles. Now turning to avionics news, Last week, we announced that the TrueTrack Autopilot had become available for installation in certificated aircraft. And this week, this comes from General Aviation News, the STC Group has received an STC for the installation kit for the Trio Pro Pilot digital autopilot. Now, previously that had only been installed in experimental aircraft. Now it's going to be available to install in dozens of models of aircraft, including Cessna 172s and 182s and more. Now, if you're not familiar with this autopilot, Trio was established back in 2000. It's a round unit that fits basically inside a standard instrument hole in an instrument panel. So that really simplifies installation. They've delivered about 3,000 of these already. They go on to say that the two-axis ProPilot model uses roll and auto trim pitch servos to provide precise horizontal and vertical navigation capabilities. It goes on to say, let's see, the STC Group is selling the installation kits in the STC for $2,000, and the autopilot itself, which is going to include the PMA and documentation, will be available starting this summer for $5,000. And now from an AvWeb podcast, an interview with Avidyne President Dan Schwinn. According to AvWeb's reporting on their podcast interview, Schwinn said that full-time internet connectivity is a fact of life for businesses, homes, and even some cars, but soon it should be common in light aircraft. Well, that's good news. That'll be fun to be able to access the internet from the air. Right now, he says, a GA aircraft is one of the few places you can go where there's no connectivity. He said that there are some solutions, of course, including Sirius XM, satellite phones, and ADS-B, but none of these are what he would call general-purpose connectivity. Avidyne says they're working on a solution, and they expect to offer a wireless hotspot of some kind and have it certified by 2018. And to wrap up our aviation coverage, from General Aviation News comes this story from the FAA that the $500 rebates are still available. So if you're an owner of a U.S.-registered fixed-wing, single-engine piston aircraft and you're not currently equipped with version 2 of ADS-B out, the rebates are still available. They're being issued on a first-come, first-served basis until all 20,000 are claimed or until the end of the one-year program, whichever comes first. Eligible aircraft owners can reserve a rebate until September 18th of this year, which is the program's last day to accept reservations, if any are still available. And for those who are keeping score, here's your update. Just 994 days left until ADS-B must be installed in January 1st of 2020. Turning now to light sport and experimental aircraft news from Flyer Magazine, which is a UK publication. Flight Design has announced a new model, the KLA 100, a two-seat training aircraft, which was built based on a government order from South Korea, but which they will now be offering to other customers. KLA, which stands for Korean Light Aircraft, according to Flight Design, has many of the safety features which they are building into their C4, which is a four-seat aircraft project that they're working on. These features include a safety cage to protect occupants, what they call stall-safe wing leading edges to help pilots retain control at low speeds, and a simple on-off fuel control. It also includes a Stratus whole aircraft parachute. Didn't even know Stratus made those, so that's interesting. It's a carbon fiber composite airframe. It's going to be powered by a 100 horsepower Rotax 912 IS engine. Avionics are going to be the Garmin G3X Touch, and cruise speed is reported to be 132 knots, with a 39-knot stall speed. It's Flight Design's first low-wing design, and it looks a little bit like the Piper Sport Cruiser. Very nice design. KLA 100 will be manufactured in the Ukraine. They're currently making just 2 CT aircraft a month. Now, the German company hopes to ramp up production once it comes out from under receivership, which is expected now later this month. From AvWeb, a new company announced plans at Sun & Fun to build a Finnish LSA amphibian in Maine. Atol Avion, so that's ATOL Avion, will be built in Brunswick Landing. The new company, called Atol USA, has formed a joint venture with a Finnish company to build and sell the aircraft in the U.S. Brunswick Landing is the former Naval Air Station Brunswick, and the Maine government has been marketing it as an aviation industrial park. Now, the U.S. company hopes for deliveries in 2018, and it looks like, according to AvWeb, the aircraft is a direct competitor for the Icon A5, though at a lower base price of about $160,000. The aircraft uses a 100 horsepower Rotax 912 IS engine in a pusher configuration. It has a useful load of 600 pounds and should clear a 50-foot obstacle off the water in just 1,500 feet. The cruise is slated to be 106 miles an hour with a range of 800 miles. Now, the company says the aircraft will also have a warranty that's linked to an onboard condition monitor that sends reports to the factory. And they say as long as the owner allows the aircraft to keep phoning home, that it will take care of any they will take care of any snags reported by the system. The airplane has a 2,000-hour 10-year warranty, and at the end of either of those cycles, they say it can be returned to the factory for a full overhaul, and the warranty will be extended for another full set of cycles. On top of the base price of $160,000, they expect to have a number of options, including skis for winter operation. Well, that should be quite some aircraft. From Kit Planes magazine, Mark and Conrad Huffstutler, the new owners of Lancair, addressed a forum of owners and builders, and they presented their plans to renew support and produce kits for the 30-year-old line of aircraft. The Huffstutlers purchased the rights and assets of Lancair from the previous owners, and they're in the process of moving all of the inventory and tooling to their location in Uvalde, Texas. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but it's Uvalde. They say that they're going to be working with Lance Niebauer, the original designer of Lancair, and they plan to start by ramping up the parts inventory to support existing fleet, which, by the way, includes about 1,100 airplanes that have flown out of the 2,200 kits that have been sold to date. They plan to, going forward, support models from the Lancair 320 on up, and will eventually be putting effort into what they call a new Mako, that's M-A-K-O, a 4-seat fixed main gear aircraft with a retractable nose gear. They didn't say whether they plan to provide future support for the pressurized Lancair 4P. Now, let me give a quick shout out to the Lancair Owners and Builders Association. A few years ago, they were quite successful at dramatically reducing the accident rate among Lancair aircraft due to more training among instructors who were flying those types of aircraft. And they were quite successful in reducing the accident rate. They are having a gathering this summer in Sante Fe, New Mexico, a lovely little town with a great airport I've been to. That's going to be on August 31st through September the 3rd. You can find out more information about that at lancairowners.com. From WBAY.com in Washington, finally some good news from D.C. U.S. Senator Tammy Baldwin, Democrat of Wisconsin, and Oklahoma Republican Senator James Inhofe are fighting to protect EAA AirVenture for years to come. They've sent a letter to the chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Transportation to direct the FAA to provide air traffic and safety services at major aviation events like EAA AirVenture. The senators say those services are essential, and without them, many events may be forced to shut down. Baldwin and Inhofe's letter requests the FAA include funding for those services in its budget for the next year. Now, the FAA has charged for those services in recent years after Congress slashed its budget through the sequester process starting in 2013. The next year, FAA and EAA agreed to terms to pay for 80 air traffic controllers and support staff during AirVenture through 2022. My recollection is that EAA is having to spend over $500,000 a year now for air traffic control services that were previously paid for by the FAA, and this proposal would restore that funding so that EAA would no longer have to pay those costs. As you probably know, for 1 week every summer, the Oshkosh Whitman Regional Airport becomes the busiest airport in the world with over 3,000 takeoffs and landings a day. And that's the news for this week. Next up, why so many people have trouble landing a Cessna 182 and what you can do to avoid crunching the nose gear. And before I get into the 182, I want to give a big thank you and shout out to AOPA. Ian Twombly, the Pilot Magazine editor, had me as a guest last week on the AOPA Hangar Talk podcast, episode number 18. We had a lot of fun talking about a lot of topics, including my being Instructor of the Year and what I try to do through that, which I explained to him. I try to promote people becoming flight instructors, particularly those of you out there who love aviation and think you might want to step your game up one more level and then share your knowledge and love with other people. And we also talked about some of the things I'm doing with people who are considering purchasing either a new or slightly used Cirrus aircraft. So go ahead, check out Hangar Talk from AOPA. And I want to give a quick shout out to the controllers at the Sacramento Executive Control Tower. I was up there yesterday working with a client flying a Cirrus. He's the Cirrus aircraft is the first one you'll hear in this transmission. There was a King Air in front of us, and in front of the King Air was a Cessna, and the controller wanted to make sure that Cessna didn't spend very much time on the runway before the King Air landed. So here's that exchange.
Cirrus 80 Romeo, you'll be number 3, sequence.
Number 3, sequence 80 Romeo.
Will that Cessna be a stop and go or full stop?
661, you're cleared for the option except stop and go. Touch and go's good.
Clear for the option 20 and touch and go's good?
Touch and go's good, stop and go not so good.
Touch and go it is, 661.
Yes, stop and go, not so good. I guess I'll have to add that to the controller phraseology handbook. I thought that was kind of cute. So let's talk about the Cessna 182. I actually wrote an article for the flying club that I teach at, the West Valley Flying Club in Palo Alto, because so many people seem to crunch the nose gear on Cessna 182s. And I did a little investigation to try and figure out what makes this aircraft a little bit more difficult to land. Now, the Cessna 182, you probably know, is really popular, and for good reasons. It's reasonably fast compared to a 172 or any other trainer, and it's relatively inexpensive to operate. It hauls a fair amount of weight, and the maintenance costs are fairly low, especially if you're comparing it to a retractable aircraft. So it's not too surprising that a lot of pilots want to check out in one soon after they complete their private in something like a Cessna 172. But the 182 does have one knock against it, which I think is undeserved. A lot of pilots will say that the 182 is nose heavy, making it difficult to land. Well, I really disagree. I don't think the 182 is that difficult to land if you know how to land it properly and you remain proficient through practice. And calling it nose heavy to me seems to be, well, kind of inappropriate. I don't think any aeronautical engineer would agree with that description. Certainly the 182 balances at its center of gravity just like any other aircraft, and the front end is not heavier than the back end. So I think calling it nose heavy is pretty unfair. Now, it is true that nose wheel damage and bent firewalls are pretty common in 182s, especially those that have spent their life as rental aircraft. So yes, it's a lot easier to make a bad landing in a 182 than a 172, and those bad landings often involve the nose wheel hitting the runway before the main wheels touch down. So I am aware of a 182 that just went in for repairs for just this kind of problem. And the shop which is repairing it, and by the way, the repairs were well over $100,000, the shop said that this was number 66. In other words, they've already repaired 65 Cessna 182s before with the same kind of damage. This aircraft was the 66th one that they had seen that they were going to fix. So it does tell you that there is an issue. There was an article on avweb.com that said, in general, quote, between 1/3 to as much as 1/2 of all accidents are what we call RLOCs, or runway loss of controls. These are overshoots, undershoots, skids, slides, crosswind incidents, hard touchdowns, and all sorts of runway mayhem related to the inability to just basically control the airplane. And they say that the Cessna 182, they found out that 58% of all the accidents listed for the 182 were these RLOCs, runway loss of controls. And they said that few other models even come close to this. So what that tells us is, yeah, the 182 does seem to have a disproportionate number of landing accidents. And they said a significant number of these were nose-first touchdowns that damaged the nose gear or crimped the firewall. So, big question, why do pilots crunch the nose on 182s more often than 172s? Well, there are a couple factors. First, let's talk about this nose-heavy issue. You know, if it were nose-heavy, it would be hard to lift the nose off the ground for takeoff, but it's not. Takeoffs in 182s really are no more difficult than any other aircraft. In fact, a lot of C-182 owners I know use 10 degrees of flaps for takeoff. And in this configuration, the 182 virtually floats off the runway with no back pressure at all. Sometimes you barely know that you've left the ground. So that certainly doesn't sound nose heavy, does it? Well, I was trying to figure out why the 182 is considered nose heavy. And this is where I guess the engineer background in me kind of came out. I'm very lucky to have a good friend, Alan Brown, who is an aeronautical engineer. He was the chief designer and later the program manager for the F-117 stealth fighter. He is incredibly knowledgeable about airplanes, and he's the guy I go to when I have these kinds of questions. So my first theory was that the dimensions of Cessna 182 elevator and its position relative to the wing were going to be different from a 172, such that the backwash off the back of the wing was going to affect the elevator differently. So I went out and I did a lot of measuring of aircraft. I measured elevator size of both planes. I measured their distances from the wing. And I concluded that, yeah, there were some minor differences, but they were so small that it's really unlikely that they could account for the differences in handling between these two airplanes. So then I had a couple rounds of discussion with Alan, and I did find one major difference between the 172 and 182 that may account for this handling difference. And that is the so-called mass balance of the elevator is significantly different between the Cessna 172 and the 182. Now, you probably know that control surfaces have to be designed to reduce oscillation or flutter. And one way to minimize flutter is to redesign the elevator in such a way that its center of gravity falls along its hinge line. This is known as the mass balancing. Well, it's pretty easy to feel the difference in the mass balancing when you're seated in these aircraft on the ground with the engine off. In that configuration, the elevator course is hanging down. Now, a pilot sitting in a Cessna 172 who pulls back on the yoke, they will lift the elevator, and they will see it takes very little force to lift the elevator up from its resting position. By contrast, if you do the same thing in a Cessna 182, a pilot's going to notice that it takes a lot more force to raise the elevator, and that's because their mass balancing is different. Now, in straight and level flight, when you're flying along, the relative wind holds the elevator in a neutral position. So obviously it doesn't hang down like it does when it's parked on the ground with a control lock out. But when you pull off the power during the landing, the wind which is generated from the prop decreases, and suddenly the elevator starts to drop, just as it does when it's parked. Now, in a Cessna 172, it takes very little back pressure on the yoke to keep the elevator from dropping when you pull the power in the flare. But in a 182, when you pull the power, it takes much more force to keep the elevator from dropping, just as it takes more force to raise the elevator when the 182 is sitting on the ground. So if you're in the flare in a 182 and you just pull the power, unless you immediately apply a significant amount of back pressure on the yoke, the elevator is going to start to drop. And when it does, the aircraft is going to pitch down. In other words, the nose is going to be headed for the runway first. And unless a pilot is prepared to quickly pull back on the yoke, you're headed for a nose wheel first landing and potential damage. And it's not because the aircraft is nose heavy. It's because of the poor mass balancing of the elevator. So here's what I recommend, and this is the technique that I teach to anyone that I'm transitioning into the Cessna 182. First, make sure that you make a final adjustment to elevator trim after you've slowed down to your final approach speed. That's going to greatly reduce the amount of muscle that you need to pull on the elevator on the yoke when you're in the flare. So I would typically recommend people land a 182 at about 65 knots. When you turn final, you're probably going to be doing more than that. You might be 75. If you were trim at 75 and you slow up on final, you're going to need to retrim again after you get back to your target speed, after you get back to around 65. So make sure you spend a little bit of time on final, not very short final as you're close to the ground, but when you're out, half a mile, 300-400 feet in the air, something like that, get that trim pretty good, get back to your 65 knots and nail that early on. Then when you go into the flare, leave some power on into the flare. And you want to avoid doing what we often do in a Cessna 182 where you're 50 feet high, you just kind of pull the power back and the airplane just sort of glides in on its own. Instead, leave some power in until you're in the flare. Then once you're level in the flare, simultaneously, this is the important part, simultaneously pull back on both the throttle and the yoke. So in other words, both your left hand and your right hand are pulling back simultaneously. That's so as the power decreases and you get less air from the prop over the elevator doesn't drop, which is going to send your nose into the runway. Then, once you're pulling back simultaneously on both the yoke and the throttle, just land the 182 as you would land any other aircraft in a nose-high attitude so that the main wheels touch down first. If you make your landings like this every time, you're going to think the Cessna 182 is easy to land, because it is when you use the proper technique. In a moment, feedback from last week's listener question. And just a quick reminder, my day-to-day job is flight instruction, and I spend a lot of time working in the Cirrus aircraft. So if you're anywhere in the country and you're contemplating buying a new or recently used Cirrus, give me a call. Happy to talk with you and give you some pointers, and might even be able to help you move the aircraft or give you additional flight instruction after you get your plane. And if you happen to be based here in the San Francisco Bay Area or you're going to visit, come fly with me. Be happy to take you out in our Cirrus aircraft here at the West Valley Flying Club. Now, wanted to read this letter I got from Bill. Bill, thanks for sending the first email reply to the podcast. Bill says, Max, I'm really glad you've launched the new podcast, which will have important safety content for GA pilots. He says, 2 quick comments on your first episode. The below minimums approach at KSUN is especially concerning given the higher required climb rate of 420 feet per nautical mile for terrain in the missed approach. And just to recap, I had a listener question, and he was talking about going below minimums on that particular approach because his autopilot coupled to the glide slope and it took him through the MDA. Bill continues, starting the mist from below the MDA could result in an accident. The RNAV GPS X-ray approach is a pretty sporty procedure, and it took the FAA a long time to develop it. Most light aircraft can't make the required missed approach rate of climb at that altitude and should be using the RNAV Yankee approach, which has a higher MDA. Yes, good point. If you are climbing out at, say, 120 knots, then that 420 feet per nautical mile climb gradient translates into an 840 foot per minute climb. And if you get a downdraft, well, you're not going to be able to make that. So that's a good issue. The second comment is your comment about fuel siphoning without a cap could lead someone astray. And in that, I was discussing fuel exhaustion accidents and saying that one cause of people running out of gas, like the Piper Aztec that we had in our story there, could be that your fuel caps either are loose and come off in flight or you forgot to put them back on. Bill says, I don't believe you'll lose a significant amount of fuel, but most importantly, where it can happen is right after takeoff if the cap is not secure. He says the cap will come off due to low pressure above the wing. There was a fatal accident a few years ago back in a Piper jet prop immediately after takeoff when they lost a cap and the pilot panicked and stall spun the aircraft, trying to quickly turn back to get on the ground. Well, let me address that in just a moment. Bill continues, says, thanks again for your hard work in doing these. By the way, I was one of the first CFIs at West Valley, which is where I teach, back in 1977. He says, I now live in Seattle and have a Piper Malibu. He says, back then the flying club had just 4 or 5 aircraft. I started instructing part-time in about 1974. I charged $6 an hour and thought that it was a little high. Take care, Bill. Boy, I bet everybody out there wishes that they were paying $6 an hour for flight instruction. And actually, that's pretty close to what I was paying back in the early 1970s, 71, when I started taking flying lessons. So I was curious about Bill's comment about how quickly the fuel might come out. And I had heard comments from folks that said that they would lose the fuel fairly quickly. And I figured might as well do some research on this. So first point, Bill, yeah, you're absolutely right. Anytime something happens in flight, like a door comes open, a fuel cap comes off, don't panic. People who panic, can end up killing themselves over something that's really trivial. So remember what military pilots are taught, which was in a case of an emergency, the first thing you do is wind the clock, which basically means you're going to take just a moment to kind of step back from the whole thing, gather your thoughts, and remember, I probably don't have to react instantaneously. Instead, I have to do the proper reaction. So I went ahead and did some research on what is the rate of fuel coming out of aircraft if the caps are missing, and I found a few different sources. This first one comes from aviation.stackexchange.com. The question was, how fast can fuel be siphoned out if you leave the cap off? And the answer that was voted most popular, the gentleman says, it can happen very quickly. I don't have exact numbers, but an acquaintance had this happen in a Cessna 172, and the entire tank was emptied in just a few minutes. The amount of time it took to do one circuit of the pattern and land. The fuel cap was not in the filler neck on departure and was hanging from the chain, banging against the wing. The moral of the story, never assume the fuelers put the cap back in. Well, of all the different sources I've found, this one is kind of the most extreme in terms of suggesting how fast the fuel could leave the aircraft. And it is secondhand. He does say that this was related to him by an acquaintance. So I think we probably don't want to put complete stock in this one, but let's look at a couple of others. Coincidentally, this source comes from the golfhotelwhiskey.com blog. I say coincidentally because it's written by my good friend Matthew Steeb out of London. And Matthew has been here to San Francisco a few times. We've had dinner before together in San Francisco with his wife. So I thought it was kind of funny that I ended up on his blog when I searched on this. Matthew says that General Aviation News printed an excerpt from an NTSB report from an accident in December 2009 involving a Cessna 182 in Bowie, Texas, that led to substantial damage to the aircraft and one minor injury, all because of a loose fuel cap. Pilot apparently topped off both tanks with 40 gallons of fuel each, so 80 gallons in total. He later told investigators he had difficulty securing the fuel cap on the right wing tank. After about 2 hours into flight, the engine stopped and the left tank gauge showed empty. The pilot attempted to switch tanks, but was unable to restart the engine, forcing him to land in a field. Both fuel tanks were empty, with the right wing fuel cap being missing. Hence, the accident was ruled as the pilot's failure to secure the fuel cap. So that 80 gallons of fuel should have lasted for about 5 hours. Instead, the aircraft ran out of fuel in about 2 hours. Now, the third source I came across is from NASA's Aviation Safety Reporting System, ASRS, in their callback newsletter from October 2015, issue number 429. And I had to smile because this is produced right here in my hometown here of Mountain View, California, by my good friend Linda Connell, who will try to get on the show here sometime. Anyway, there are 3 similar fuel cap missing accidents related in this newsletter. Get this, 2 of them are Cessna 182s, as were the other ones that we just looked at, and one of them is an SR22. And I'm going to use the SR22 one because that's kind of interesting. This pilot writes that the field he was at only offered self-serve fuel, something I am trained to do but don't do very often. I taxied the airplane to the self-serve station and followed the procedure for refueling my airplane. I added a total of 12.5 gallons of fuel, 6 in the right wing, 6.5 gallons in the left wing. After fueling, I purposely left the fuel caps on top of the wings with the intention to come back and visually check the fuel before departure. Let me take a moment and say, do you see a problem here? I have no idea why he thought it was a good idea to leave those caps on top of the wing. I would never walk away from the aircraft just leaving the caps on top of the wing. It would be an easy thing to forget, and guess what? He did. After I was done fueling, I forgot to do my final check of the aircraft where I would have checked the fuel caps. After fueling, I started the engine, did my normal before takeoff check and run-up, got an IFR clearance. All indications were normal, but I failed to notice that I was missing my fuel caps. I flew for about an hour before I checked in with approach. They advised that an SR22 fuel cap was found at the departure airport, and they suspected it could be mine. Approach advised me that my company wanted me to land as soon as possible to see if I was missing some fuel caps. Approach suggested that I go to an alternate airport, and I agreed since this was a good option for me at the time. I had the airport in sight and got cleared with a visual approach. I made sure I stay high on my approach in case of any issues with the engine. Landing was normal, and on the ground I noticed that I was missing both of my fuel caps. I parked the airplane and followed our procedures to cover the fuel tanks until the next day when our mechanic came with replacement fuel caps. Well, it's funny that they felt it was important to cover the fuel tanks, afterwards. Gosh, if only he kept them covered at the beginning by leaving the fuel caps in. Anyway, that aside, let's just kind of take a look at the fuel flow rates. Depending on the year of the Cirrus, it has either 82 gallons or 92 gallons. Let's say it had 82 gallons in it, and let's say it was full. He flew an hour. Obviously, he did not siphon out the full 80 gallons in that 1 hour period of time. So I think Bill's point is probably a good one, which is, yes, the fuel does come out of the tanks, but it's not going to come out instantly. It seems unlikely that it's going to come out in one loop around the pattern, as the first reporter suggested here. But the bottom line is you have to be incredibly cautious about fuel. Fuel makes up about 11% of all accidents in this country. All of those accidents are preventable through very simple procedures that we talked about in episode 1, which is basically making sure that you've checked multiple ways to verify that you have sufficient fuel for your flight. And that wraps it up for this week's edition of Aviation News Talk. And I wanted to ask for your help. I have yet to have any reviews on this podcast, so no matter what app you're on, whether you're on iTunes or Google Music Play or Stitcher, why don't you go ahead and leave a review if you really enjoyed the show. Give us 5 stars. And if you didn't like the show, just send me an email and tell me what you'd like to see differently. You can find our show notes at aviationnewstalk.com. On the iPhone podcast app, you can also just touch the cover artwork there. You'll see the show notes and our contact information. Remember, if you have any questions you'd like to answer on the show, just go ahead and leave a message in the voicemail box 650-967-2500 or touch the contacts link inside the show notes. So until next time, fly safely and keep the blue side up.